Have you ever felt that urge to go where no one else dares? To step over the velvet rope? To see what's truly forbidden? It's a powerful thrill, that search for the authentic experience. But what if, at the end of the tunnel, you discover that authenticity was a trap, and you were the main attraction? At Nightmare at 3 a.m., we know that curiosity is the first door to the nightmare. If you have a curious and dark side too, hit that like button so we know we're among friends. Subscribe so you don't get lost in the dark with us. And comment below. What forbidden place would you be brave enough to explore? My name is Chloe, and I need you to believe me. The doctors don't believe me. The embassy doesn't believe me. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I don't even believe it myself. But then I look at the mark on my wrist, and I know it was real. It all started as a love story, my love story. Sitting next to me on the plane taking off from JFK, Liam held my hand, his eyes shining with the same excitement that made my heart beat faster. 5 years together, an engagement ring on my finger, and our reward. 2 weeks in Greece, Santorini, Mykonos. The names sounded like a promise. This was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. Nothing can go wrong, he whispered. The irony of that sentence is a knife that twists in my chest every day. The first 6 hours of the flight were a happy prelude to a horror movie. Then, over Europe, the plane began to shake. The captain's voice, strained, announced an unprecedented storm and a diversion to a small regional airport in western Serbia, a place he could barely pronounce, Zlatiborac. Hey, an unexpected adventure, Liam said, ever the optimist. A story to tell. He couldn't imagine it. Zlatiborac Airport looked like a concrete scar from the Soviet era, forgotten by time. The air was cold and smelled of coal. The city in the distance was a dark smudge of peaked rooftops against a gray sky. Reality hit us fast. No cell phone signal, declined cards, no help from the airline. We were stranded. The only taxi took us to the city center, a maze of cobblestone streets and buildings that seemed to be watching us. People stared at us with silent intensity, and on many dark wooden doors we saw the same carved symbol, a spiral with 3 dashes. The statues in the squares were not of heroes, but skeletal, hooded figures with faces in agony. Different culture, Liam muttered, more to convince himself than me. But the feeling of being in a fundamentally wrong place was like a physical weight. Night and a cold mist descended upon us. Then the horror I could understand found us. In a dimly lit alley, 2 men robbed us. They took our money and Liam's grandfather clock. In the melee, my fiance's hand was cut by a knife blade. It wasn't deep, but the blood ran down, bright red against the pale stone. Shivering, we sat on the threshold of a shop. A door opened, and an elderly woman in a black shawl beckoned us inside. Her shop smelled of dried herbs. She gave us hot tea and bread. I wept with gratitude. Then she saw Liam's hand. Her eyes widened, fixed on the blood. A primal panic filled her face. She began to mutter, making a strange gesture in the air, and I saw on her wrinkled wrist a faded tattoo of the same symbol as the doors. She pushed us out, back into the mist, and locked the door. Help had turned to rejection. Liam's blood was not just blood, it was a brand. That was when the bells began to ring. Not a melodious church bell, but a discordant sound, coming from all directions, calling people out of their homes. The streets filled with a silent procession. The people wore dark clothes. Some wore masks, carved from wood, with long, sad faces like the statues in the squares. They were not celebrating. They moved with a dark purpose, and I soon realized that the focus of this march was us. The masked heads turned toward us in unison. The robbery had not been random. It had been a preparation. We had been weakened, isolated, and Liam's blood had marked us as the center of the ritual that was about to begin. We ran. The narrow streets became a maze designed to trap us. Behind us, there was no sound of hurried footsteps, only the silent, relentless advance of the human tide. They surrounded us in a small square dominated by a bonfire that burned high, casting dancing shadows on masked faces. Strong hands grabbed us. There was no anger in their touch, only a cold, ritualistic efficiency. I was forced to my knees, held down by two men. Liam struggled, but was subdued and dragged toward the fire. I saw the old woman from the shop in the crowd. Our eyes met, and hers were filled with a mixture of pity and terror. Her lips moved, forming a single word that the wind carried to me: offering. A tall figure in a raven mask approached Liam. She carried no weapon. She knelt in front of him and placed her hand flat on my fiancé's chest. Liam screamed. It was a sound that tore through the night and into my soul. I watched him writhe, and something terrible began to happen. The light seemed to drain from his eyes. His skin, once flushed with cold, turned gray and taut over his bones. It was as if the vitality, the youth, the very life itself was being sucked out of him, drained into the masked figure. The process lasted for an eternity of 10 seconds. Then the screaming stopped. Liam's body went limp, an empty shell. The raven figure stood up and raised its arms to the crowd, who remained utterly silent. The feast was over. I don't know why they let me go. Maybe the offering had satisfied the city's hunger. Maybe I was insignificant. When the first gray light of dawn touched the sky, the crowd dispersed as silently as it had formed, leaving me alone in the square with what was left of Liam. I don't remember how I got to the airport. It was a blur of shock and instinct. The airport staff acted as if nothing had happened. On the flight back, I was an empty shell. In Frankfurt, I tried to tell the embassy. The police, they looked at me with pity. The story of an American girl in shock over the sudden and tragic death of her fiancé. The official report, which arrived weeks later, said massive cardiac arrest. The airline had no record of any diversion to Serbia. Zlatiborac Airport, I was told, does not exist on any commercial flight maps. My story was impossible. My pain was diagnosed as a grief-induced psychotic episode. I'm home now. The engagement ring is still on my finger. They told me I had to accept reality, but I know what I saw. And I have proof that I've never shown anyone because there's no way to explain it. Sometimes, when the silence of the night is deep, I look at my left wrist. There, pale as an old scar, is the mark, the spiral with 3 lines. It appeared that morning after the procession. It doesn't hurt. It's just there, a permanent reminder that I escaped Zlatiborac. But a part of that place never let me go. My name is Alex. I decided to travel to Ireland alone because cliches are sometimes true. I needed to find myself after a breakup that took away my apartment, my dog, and my dignity. The idea was simple: rent a car, drive the winding coastal roads, drink stout in cozy pubs, and lose myself in the green expanse. It was supposed to be a healing journey, a new beginning. The flight from New York to Dublin was nearly empty. and I felt comfortable with the solitude, like it was armor. I was in control. The first sign that I had absolutely no control came in the form of violent turbulence over the North Atlantic. The pilot's voice, with an Irish accent that should have been comforting, sounded worried. A freak summer storm with near hurricane-force winds had closed the airspace over all of Ireland and the United Kingdom. We were to be diverted to the only airport in the region capable of receiving us safely. A place I had to look up on the map on the back of my seat. Vagar, in the Faroe Islands. I looked out the window and saw only a gray, choppy sea meeting black, jagged rocks. At that moment, in the middle of nowhere between Scotland and Iceland, my journey of self-discovery began to transform into something else. At the small modern airport in Vagar, chaos was under control. There were about 100 of us stranded in one of the most remote places in Europe. That was where I met her. Her name was Esla, an Australian backpacker with blonde hair and an easy smile who seemed immune to the panic around us. "I don't think we'll make it to Copenhagen anytime soon," she said, laughing. We were united by our shared misfortune, 2 English speakers in a sea of Danish and Faroese. We decided to share a taxi and a room, if we could find one, to save what little money we had. There was an instant camaraderie, the fragile trust that strangers form in crisis situations. "At least we're in this together," I said. It was a comforting lie. In truth, we were terribly alone. The taxi dropped us off in Sørvágur, a small fishing village nestled between a green mountain and a dark fjord. The houses had grass roofs and colorful walls, which should have been charming, but under the low gray sky, they seemed eerie. There were no hotels, just one guest house that was fully booked. The few locals we saw on the streets looked at us with blank curiosity, their clear blue eyes not seeming to register us at all. The atmosphere was one of profound isolation, a place that time and the rest of the world had agreed to forget. The strangeness began with the fog. It rolled in from the sea without warning, thick and damp, muffling all sound and reducing visibility to just a few feet. It was a fog with a personality, and within it, we began to hear a sound, a low melodic hum, almost like a throat singing that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "It's the wind blowing over the rocks," Isla rationalized, but her eyes showed she didn't believe it any more than I did. As we walked through the hills surrounding the village, looking for a place to shelter, we saw the cairns. Piles of stones, hundreds of them dotting the landscape. They didn't look like trail markers. They were arranged in strange patterns, like silent sentinels, and in some of them, objects were wedged between the stones. A length of ship's rope, a polished shell, a fish bone bleached white with age. They looked like offerings. Offerings for what? I didn't want to know. Night fell, and with it, a biting cold. Hunger and exhaustion overcame us. We found an abandoned fishing shack near the shore, smelling of salt and dried fish, and decided it was better than sleeping outside. We huddled inside, sharing a chocolate bar, the only food we had. The fog outside was so thick, it looked like a white wall. That was when the melodic humming came back, closer than ever, and with it, the lights. We peered through a crack in the rotten wood of the shack. Above the dark waters of the fjord, where the fog was thickest, floated spheres of pale blue light. They weren't boats. They danced slowly in the air, circling one another in a silent, hypnotic ballet, in perfect sync with the song that now seemed to come from the water itself. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing I had ever seen. It wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was something conscious, intelligent. The next morning, exhausted and frightened, we tried to get help. We approached an old fisherman who was mending his nets on the pier. I pointed at the water, trying to imitate the dancing lights with my hands and reproduce the sound of the buzzing. The man's face, once a map of time-worn wrinkles, turned pale as wax. He dropped his nets, spat on the ground, and made a quick gesture with his hands over his chest as if warding off evil. He turned his back on us and walked away quickly, almost running, without looking back. His terror was our confirmation. What we had seen last night was not only real, it was something that the locals feared to the point of not even acknowledging its existence to outsiders. The fear the fishermen showed us was contagious. From that moment on, we were no longer just lost tourists. We were outcasts. The news that we had seen the lights somehow seemed to spread through the village as fast as the fog. The few people who had once looked at us curiously now looked away. Mothers pulled their children inside their homes as we approached. At the village's only tiny grocery store, the lady behind the counter shook her head and pointed to a closed sign, even though it had clearly been opened moments before. They had isolated us. We were completely alone on an island in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by people who treated us as if we were carrying the plague. The melodic humming became an almost constant companion. Sometimes it was just a low note on the wind. Other times it seemed to come from beneath the earth. And it began to have a strange effect on us, especially on Isla. She, who had once been so energetic and talkative, became quiet, introspective. I would find us standing still for long periods, staring out at the misty sea, her head slightly tilted, as if listening to a distant conversation. "It's not a scary sound, is it?" she once said to me, with a calmness that terrified me. "It's beautiful. It sounds like promise." The fog also became more aggressive, and within it, I began to see shapes. They were quick, fleeting glimpses at the edge of my vision. Tall, thin silhouettes that moved with a fluid grace, as if they were made of water vapor itself. They disappeared the moment I turned to face them. I tried to tell myself it was the fatigue, the hunger, the paranoia, but I knew it wasn't. It was them, the owners of this corner, of these lights, and I had the terrible feeling that they were studying us, sizing us up. Our second night in the fishing shack was the beginning of the end. The fog was thicker than ever, pressing against the flimsy walls of the shack, and the hum was no longer an ambient sound. It was there, with us, seeming to resonate in the very wood. The blue lights returned, more numerous and brighter, dancing on the waves just ahead of us. I was terrified, but Isla was not. She stood and walked to the door, her eyes fixed on the lights, a serene smile on her face. "They're dancing again, Alex," she whispered, her voice dreamy. "It's for us. It's an invitation." "Isla, no," I said, stepping in front of her. "This isn't real. It's a trap." "It's the most real thing I've ever felt," she replied, her eyes not really seeing me. "The music, it tells me there's no more pain, no more cold, just the dance." She tried to push past me. I grabbed her arms. Her strength was surprising, a feverish energy that belied her thin, tired body. She shoved me aside with a force that knocked me to the ground. "I have to go," was the last thing she said. She opened the door and stepped out into the mist. I ran after her, shouting her name. I saw her as a figure running barefoot over the wet rocks of the beach toward the water. Blue lights descended from the sky and surrounded her, swirling around her like giant fireflies. The melodic hum grew, becoming a chorus of otherworldly voices, a beautiful harmony, overwhelming and terrifying. I saw Isla's silhouette walk into the dark, icy sea without hesitation. The lights enveloped her completely in a blinding glow. The chorus hit a final note that seemed to make the air vibrate. And then silence, absolute, profound silence. The lights went out, the music stopped, and Isla was gone. I was left alone on the beach, in the darkness, the only sound, the sound of my own terrified sniffles and the crash of the waves against the shore. The next morning dawned bright and sunny, as if the night before had been someone else's nightmare. The fog had lifted, the sky was a clear blue, and the town looked almost normal. I walked back to the main square, an empty automaton. The bus to the airport was there, waiting. The locals were out on the streets, and their gazes toward me had changed. There was no longer hostility. There was only a deep, ancient pity, as if they were looking at someone who had survived a sacrifice. No one asked about the Australian girl I was with. It was as if she had never existed. I got on a bus, caught the flight, and escaped. Back in the States, I tried to tell the story to the police, to the Australian embassy. They listened patiently, took my statement, and treated me like a traumatized man on the verge of a nervous breakdown. A tragic case. A young tourist who had probably slipped on the rocks and been swept away by the sea. My story of lights and songs was seen as what it seemed, the invention of a mind in shock. With no body, no evidence, I was simply the last person to have seen her alive. The suspicion was never spoken out loud, but it hung in the air. I was alone with my impossible truth. It's been 6 months. I've moved to an apartment in the country, far from the ocean. I try not to think about islands, about fog, about Isla's smile. I try to believe their version of the story. It's easier. But sometimes, when the night is very still or when the rain patters against the window, I'll hear it. It starts softly, almost imperceptibly in the hum of the refrigerator or the static on the TV. A low melodic hum. The song, "I've escaped the islands, but I haven't escaped the song." And sometimes, when the morning fog is thick, I feel a terrible, sweet urge to open the door, go outside, and join in the dance. My name is Leo, and I used to be the kind of person who collected experiences like trophies. While my friends posted pictures of beaches and resorts, my Instagram feed was a feed of abandoned sanatoriums, ghost towns, and crumbling prisons. I didn't want to see history in museums. I wanted to feel its shivers down my spine. This quest for an authentic thrill took me to Paris, but not to the Eiffel Tower or the Louvre. My destination was what lay beneath the city, the catacombs. And I wasn't interested in the official tour, the well-lit, safe path for tourists. I wanted the real labyrinth, the forbidden vaults where 6 million souls rest in eternal darkness. Through an obscure urban exploration forum, I found a man who called himself Silas. He promised, for an exorbitant price paid in cash, to take me to the untouched depths of the ossuary. He was my golden ticket to the discomfort I so desperately sought. We met near a sewer entrance on a side street in the 14th arrondissement. Silas was a thin, pale man with the eyes that seemed unblinking. He handed me a helmet with a headlamp and gave me 3 rules. First, stay in the light of your flashlight at all times. Second, do not touch any bones that are arranged in a pattern. Third, and most important, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, no matter what you hear, do not speak. The silence here is ancient and does not like to be broken. I smiled. I thought it was all part of a macabre theater to justify the money I had paid. I was wrong. It was not theater. It was a ritual. We descended a spiral staircase into the cold, damp darkness. The smell of wet earth and something else, something mineral and ancient, filled my lungs. The first few galleries were as I had imagined, low, cramped tunnels, their walls meticulously constructed of femurs and skulls. The light from our flashlights danced across the empty eye sockets, creating writhing shadows. It was magnificently morbid. I was in heaven. But as we went deeper, the silence grew heavier. It was a soundlessness so profound that I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. Then Silas stopped abruptly. He put a finger to his lips. I turned off my flashlight as he had instructed, and in the pitch black, I heard it. A low, dry sound, a rustling like thousands of dry leaves being dragged across the stone floor, or like the sound of tiny bones rolling over each other. That sound shattered my arrogance. I looked at Silas, and the beam of his flashlight revealed the panic in his eyes. This fear wasn't an act. He was genuinely terrified. "What is that?" I whispered, breaking rule number 3. He gave me a look of pure terror and rage and frantically waved me to be quiet. He pulled me into a side tunnel, and the rustling sound seemed to move down the main hallway past us. My heart was in my throat. I, who had come for a thrill, was now paralyzed by a fear I had never imagined. I realized I was completely lost. My cell phone had been dead since we'd descended, and the compass in my pocket was spinning wildly. I wasn't an explorer. I was a child following a stranger into the dark woods. And the woods were alive. We walked on for another hour, fear now a cold presence in the pit of my stomach. The rustling came and went, sometimes distant, sometimes seeming to be just around the next bend. I began to notice things were wrong. The piles of bones lining the walls seemed different. A skull that I was sure had been facing forward now appeared to be in profile, as if it had been watching us pass. I told myself it was my mind, the light and shadows playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched by 6 million dead eyes was overwhelming. Our flashlights began to flicker. The darkness at the edges of our small circle of light seemed to stir, as if it were alive and hungry, waiting to swallow us whole. We reached a larger cavern, a circular chamber where the walls were a massive tapestry of bones stacked to the ceiling. The sound of rustling was everywhere now, a constant dry whisper coming from every direction. Silas was sweating, muttering to himself in a language I didn't recognize. He seemed to be searching for a specific exit, his panic growing by the second. Then, with an electric buzz, both of our flashlights went out at once. The darkness that swallowed us was absolute. It wasn't just an absence of light. It was a substance, a pressure that pushed at me from every direction. And the rustling became deafening. That's when Silas screamed. It was a horrible sound, a scream that was suddenly cut off by a wet crack. I heard the sound of his body being dragged across the stone floor, followed by the most sickening noise I'd ever heard. The sound of bones breaking, dry and methodical. A crackling red light illuminated the cavern for an instant. A flare Silas must have dropped, and in that hellish light I saw it. There was no monster, no creature. The walls were moving, the bones were alive. A wave of femurs and skulls slid down the wall and over Silas's body like a swarm of calcium insects. Skulls rolled and embedded themselves in his torso, arms pulling him into the pile, which opened to receive him. Silas was not my guide. He was the payment, the offering to keep the place quiet. The flare died, leaving me alone in the darkness with the sound of my guide being dismantled and filed away. I ran, I don't know how, I don't know where. I ran in blind panic in the pitch black, tripping over bones, bumping into walls, screaming without a voice. I ran for hours, days, I don't know. My mind broke and reformed itself over and over again. At some point, I felt a draft. I followed it, crawling, crying, until I found the base of a ventilation shaft. I climbed, my nails cracking against the stone, until I collapsed on a Paris street, covered in dirt and the dust of dead men. As the first light of dawn painted the sky, I went to the police. I told them my story. They looked at me like I was crazy. All I had was a username, Silas, from a forum I could no longer find. There was no record of its existence. To them, I was just another tourist who had a panic attack in the tunnels. I'm home now in New York. I've never been back to Paris. The blog is down. I can't stand dark places anymore. I sleep with the lights on. And the worst part is that I know I didn't come back alone. Last night, as I was unpacking my backpack from that trip, something small and white fell out of a side pocket. A bone. A single, small bone from a human finger, smooth and polished. I didn't pick it up. It was a gift. A souvenir. And every night, when silence settles in my apartment, I hear it. A low, dry sound coming from the darkest corner of my room. The sound of a solitary bone dragging itself on the floor, waiting for the rest of the body.